war is all about the economy. A massive military is the backbone of an empire's global interests, but it also drains a lot of resources. In December 2017, then-President Trump ordered an investigation into the Pentagon's finances, marking the first time the Department of Defense faced a full audit. This effort not only flopped quickly but also continued to go nowhere over the next 4 years. Plus, the federal government spends about an extra $1 billion a year on audits for this. Back in 1990, Congress passed a law requiring all federal agencies to submit audited financial statements regularly, but so far, the Department of Defense is the only one that has never passed an audit. Still, that hasn't stopped military spending from skyrocketing from $280 billion in the 90s to a whopping $858 billion today. Even considering inflation, this number is higher than any year during the Cold War. Clearly, no U.S. administration has been able to rein in the ever-expanding defense budget. Private contractors are raking in more than half of all defense spending. They generously fund various campaigns and support lobbyists in Congress and the government. Some lawmakers, even if they have critical views, don't want to be labeled as the ones weakening national defense. Meanwhile, the military keeps looking for enemies to prove its worth, leading to a never-ending cycle of war. In 1850, the 49-year-old French classical economist Frédéric Bastiat was wrapping up his last work. His lungs were pretty much wrecked by tuberculosis, and a bad cough was getting in the way of his writing. Back in those days when most fields were still figuring themselves out, economics was especially filled with all sorts of bizarre ideas. For example, if a naughty kid broke a window, the homeowner might be upset, but for society as a whole, it was actually a good thing because it meant the glass factory and the repair guys would have more work, which would boost the overall economy. Bastiat was arguing against these seemingly sensible economic fallacies. Basically, the money a homeowner uses to fix his windows is likely the same money he would have spent on bread or new clothes. The profits made by glass factories and repairmen come at the expense of bakeries and clothing stores. This idea can apply more broadly. For a country, destructive activities might look like they boost demand and help the economy, but in reality, it's just a matter of balancing losses with gains, and there's no real benefit to it. This concept is known as the broken window fallacy, and it's discussed in Bastiat's final work, What is Seen and What Is Not Seen. However, less than 100 years after his death, an American economist named Edward Sadler pointed out the flaws in his theory. If a broken window is in another country, it could actually be good for countries with glass factories. This idea came about in the 1940s and is known as the perpetual war economy theory. Sad's theory comes from his observations of the U.S. economy before and after World War II. From December 1942 to August 1943, he worked at the Price Control Office in Washington, and the following year, he was an editor for war production statistics at the War Production Board. This role gave him access to confidential data related to all stages of the U.S. war production plan. After that, Sad was promoted to head the Parts Planning Office, where he was in charge of assessing the supply and demand for critical components. Through these experiences, Sad gained a deep understanding of the U.S. economy before and after World War II. In February 1944, Sad's work Towards a Permanent War Economy was published, which discussed the situation around 1940. How the U.S. got into a war economy by supplying military goods to all sides of the conflict, which really changed the face of the American economy. For example, the airplane industry quickly became a key player in the war, growing faster than any other industry in U.S. history. Meanwhile, with all the money pouring in, inflation kept rising, effectively cutting workers' wages while businesses saw their profits soar. So, more and more big companies have built up a ton of capital through retained earnings, which has also changed the structure of the bourgeoisie. Small businesses keep getting merged or wiped out, and control over large enterprises is becoming more concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. Sartre predicted that because the economic benefits of this model were so huge, the U.S. would immediately start preparing for World War III right after World War II ended. The result will be a kind of permanent war economy, where military spending acts like government-led public works, helping to smooth out the ups and downs of the U.S. economy. Sad estimates that the U.S. will maintain this permanent war economy with an annual military budget of $20 billion after the war, but the reality is even crazier than he predicted. In 1951, U.S. military spending shot past $34 billion and just kept climbing. But the basic logic of wartime economics hasn't changed: break other countries' windows and then sell them glass. These days, the US not only maintains the largest military in the world, but also exports about $300 billion in arms every year, making up roughly half of global weapons sales. Even scarier, the military itself has gone beyond its original purpose. It operates more like a business now, chasing profits. In August 2018, in the seventh largest city of North Carolina, a Southern cuisine restaurant called Lucky 32 had two special guests. James Cain, looking sharp in a crisp suit jacket, was enjoying his favorite creamy shrimp chowder. Cain is a big name in American politics. He's been the chairman of the Eastern North Carolina Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. ambassador to Denmark, and was even a hot contender for the Senate this week. Sitting across from him was a tall, lean middle-aged man, sitting up straight with a classic flat-top haircut. The guy's name is James Reese, and he used to be a colonel in the U.S. Army's Delta Force. Now, he's running a private security firm. He just got back from northeastern Syria, where he met with some local anti-government groups that have U.S. support. He's got this really tempting plan because that war-torn area happens to be one of Syria's main oil-producing regions. Reese claims that thanks to his connections in the military, they can totally sneak the oil out of Syria under the protection of U.S. forces. Now he just needs some startup cash to rebuild the damaged oil drilling equipment. It's estimated that this project could bring in billions in revenue every year. While Reese makes it sound easy, Cain knows that the bigger the profits, the bigger the problems are likely to be. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be looking to partner up with him. First off, without a heavyweight politician like Cain backing it, no one's gonna risk putting money into a war-torn area. Even if you could sneak oil out of Syria, figuring out how to get it clean and onto the international market is a real headache. And lastly, and most importantly, there are a ton of stakeholders involved, and everyone wants a piece of the pie, so you need someone to mediate. A few weeks later, Cain flew to London to secure funding for the project, and not long after that, a company called Delta Star Energy was formed. But it's not like the energy companies in Pudong. There are hundreds of fully armed American soldiers on guard day and night, protecting the company's oil infrastructure. The transport trucks are constantly under the watch of armored vehicles from the U.S. military, which are smuggling oil from northeastern Syria to the Iraqi border. Then, in December 2018, President Trump unexpectedly announced the decision to withdraw troops from Syria, which infuriated many diplomats, military leaders, and government officials involved in Middle Eastern policy. At the same time, Cain and Reese's vast network began to spring into action. Including Syria's Special Representative Jeffrey and Senator Graham from South Carolina, they started pressuring Washington. In February 2019, when the U.S. government officially announced the troop withdrawal from Syria, about 400 to 1,000 soldiers were sent to follow the main forces out. Their main job was to keep stealing oil from northern Syria. Not only that, but their operations continued to expand. According to local witnesses, they sometimes handled transporting wheat or any useful items they confiscated from grain storage across the region, including disaster relief supplies that Syria received after the earthquake. This situation is still going on today. The way the U.S. military is acting like a bunch of bandits is really hurting America's image in the Arab world and messing up long-term interests in the region. But the decision-makers way up in the White House, tangled up in all sorts of pressures from various interests, are opting for compromise and can't stop U.S. troops overseas from acting in their own interests. This isn't an isolated case, we've seen it happen before on the battlefield in Afghanistan. In 2001, the area of poppy cultivation in Afghanistan was 82,000 hectares. By 2021, when the U.S. military pulled out, that number had skyrocketed to 224,000 hectares, supplying 82% of the global market demand. Interestingly, during the first few years of the U.S. occupation, the government tried some anti-drug initiatives and even allocated $800 million specifically for that purpose. But in the long run, establishing a stable and healthy government in Afghanistan, which could become a lasting ally for the U.S. and Central Asia, was seen as more aligned with imperial interests. But soon the White House realized that Afghanistan's poppy production wasn't dropping at all, in fact, it was skyrocketing. The reason? They had set up solar-powered underground irrigation systems for the poppy fields and were using high-yield genetically modified seeds. These GMO poppies not only doubled their output but also matured faster. Originally, it was a situation where there were 2 layers of complexity, but now it's possible to have 3 layers in a year. Clearly, Afghanistan doesn't have the technology to support this. The U.S. troops stationed overseas openly disregard orders from the White House, driven by their own interests, even at the cost of undermining the long-term strategy of the empire. This is a big reason why the puppet government collapsed just 3 months after the U.S. military left. However, everything comes at a cost. The ever-expanding U.S. military, once it has the means to generate profit, will act like a self-replicating species, constantly stretching its reach until it starts to scare the U.S. itself. 3 weeks before Christmas in December 2020, the pine woods outside Fayetteville, North Carolina's 6th largest city, started to come alive. This area is a popular camping spot, and the picturesque MacArthur Lake, one of the water sources for nearby towns, is also a paradise for fishermen. But the most popular activity this season is deer hunting. For adults whose childhoods are long gone, an exciting hunt and some tasty venison are way more satisfying than any gift from Santa. But this Christmas, before the hunting season even kicked off, a deer hunter stumbled upon a different kind of kill. A modified gray Chevrolet was stuck in a ditch by MacArthur Lake, and inside the car and on the ground nearby lay 2 dead bodies, with eggshells scattered all around. Before long, the police from Fayetteville arrived at the scene, but soon another group of uniformed people showed up and told the officers that they couldn't investigate the murder because of the victim's special status. The Army's Criminal Investigation Command had taken over the case. The victim was 37-year-old William Levine, a member of Delta Force, the U.S. military's elite unit. Timothy Dumas, 44, had secret training in explosives, tracking, assassination, and undercover work. He served 19 years in the Army and was working as an accountant in the logistics department of the 7th Special Forces in Prague before he died. Both victims had served at the nearby Prague Fort military base, which is one of the largest military facilities in the world and is part of the U.S. Army base in North Carolina. What's even more important is that this place is home to 2 of the most significant units in the massive and complex special operations structure of the Pentagon, the U.S. Army Special Operations Command and the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command. These 2 agencies are key players in the military's black operations, handling the country's riskiest missions that the government will never officially acknowledge, like assassinating foreign leaders or sabotaging critical military and even civilian facilities. Plus, the U.S. government can bypass Congress when it comes to authorizing these operations. At any time, special operations forces can be ordered to carry out special military actions. Over the past few decades of ongoing wars, the budget and power of the U.S. Special Operations Forces have been steadily increasing, from the snowy peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains to the deserts of Somalia, and even around European allies in the Baltic Sea. The soldiers involved in the operation are operating in a gray area where morals and laws have blurred. They don't know, nor are they allowed to know, who issued the orders. They don't care whether the methods to achieve the goals are appropriate, as long as the mission gets done and remains under wraps. Essentially, anything goes as long as the task is completed. In fact, for these people, the real danger comes after the mission is over. According to incomplete stats, in 2020 alone, 44 active personnel from Fort Bragg were either erased or died under mysterious circumstances. This number far exceeds any other U.S. military base, and almost all the investigation's conclusions have never been disclosed. The entire Fort Bragg has turned into a secret army within the U.S. military, a super-privileged organization that operates without any legal oversight. As President Eisenhower warned in his farewell speech on January 17, 1961, the combination of a massive military establishment and a large arms industry is a new thing for America. We have to prevent the military-industrial complex from gaining unchecked influence, or it could end up threatening the United States itself. Clearly, his warning didn't work. As long as war can bring in enough profit, the war factories won't stop until they completely destroy their host.